what do we do about such and such? How do we find a plumber? And because I've been here so long, people think I know stuff. There's an advantage to never moving.
That's right.
Hey, let me introduce you properly. This is a podcast in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We are live on YouTube, and then we go everywhere podcasts go. And my guest today is Phyllis. Do you say Leavitt or Leavitt?
Leavitt.
Leavitt. I figured, but I'll ask. And then if I mispronounce, you can just correct me.
Sure.
Phyllis is a psychotherapist based in Teos, New Mexico, with over 30 years experience. She holds a master's degree in psychology and counseling from Antioch University. She is the author of the book, America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. Please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and to my podcast on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said, on frankschaeffer.substack.com. With that out of the way, let me just hold the book up here. I just finished reading it today. If you'll notice, I have a Band-Aid here. I just had a melanoma taken off by a wonderful plastic surgeon. He got all the margins. I'm fine, but I'm still healing up. You can sort of see some of the plastic surgery stuff. The piece in the middle is sort of like a little more raw, so forgive me. But that's what the Band-Aid's about. Here's the book, and I just want to show you something, Phyllis, that should do your heart good as an author. Take a look at all the dog ears here.
Oh, that does my heart good.
When I say I read it, I mean I read it, and I underlined a lot of stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to jump to something in the back as my opener on the book, and then I'm going to go through various passages and draw you out on what this book is about. So forgive me for jumping here, but it's a good summary at the back. Main points, and you have a summary here. So rather than making you tell us the main points, I'm going to take advantage of the fact you wrote them all down. The main threat to our continued survival as a nation and a species is our deteriorating mental health. Many of the practices and policies of our most powerful institutions mirror abuse, family dynamics on the individual level, and have an increasingly disastrous effect on all of us. Abuse dynamics are caused by and cause broken bonds of care and connection between people. The hope for America is to understand that conflicting ideologies are not the cause of our problem. It is our declining mental health that has us believe we are entitled to hurt others in order to get our way. We can best understand the roots of violence in the family of America by looking through the lens of all we know about dysfunctional and abusive families on the individual level. Okay, so there's more at the end of the book, but I'm going to ask people to read your book before I get into it. But that kind of is a good setup of why you wrote the book, because you answer the questions inherent in what you bring up in those points. I'm sorry to jump like that to the end, because there's so much in the beginning and middle we're going to be going through. But does that kind of summarize? I'm not so much what your book is about, but why you wrote it. These are the questions you're answering. You're telling us how to address these issues, or am I putting words in your mouth?
No, you did. That's great. And whatever's at the end is also in the beginning. So
It
so
is, yes.
it all leads together.
So I have a basic question for you about you personally. People always ask you, what do you do? And, they usually mean, what's your profession? And of course, in my case, I'm an author. That's how I earn my living, blah, 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 blah. But I'm 72 now, and I've just had melanoma removed, and I've got grandchildren living across the street. And what I actually do, if you really want to know what my profession is that I care about, is taking care of the people who are in my family and watching over them and really caring about their mental health. Is a weird way to put it, but I really do. So right now, for instance, I'm terrifically happy because my youngest granddaughter, who's 10, has just changed schools, and she's now down at a school her mom works at, and that her older brother and sister go to. And she comes out of there and bounces out with a smile on her face. She's so happy. And the last school she was at, she wasn't, because the class, there were some people in it who weren't terribly nice, and it was kind of a tough place to be. And her mental well-being, basically, I ride or fall on it. In other words, what condition my children and grandchildren are in is basically how I'm feeling at any given moment. So the first thing I want to say about American therapy is I really resonated with your thesis. I love the book, and I thank you for writing it. But I think, talking to you as a therapist for a minute, nothing is business to me anymore. It's all personal. So when I read your book, I'm thinking of my family, my children, the world they're growing up in. I'm not thinking about some issue out there. And I don't know whether that resonates with you and what you deal with when you counsel people.
It absolutely resonates with me. And I think in the world that we live in today, there's almost no separation. But like I have 3 children, I have 3 grandchildren, I have a
Yeah.
wonderful husband, and he has 2 children and a new grandchild. And we really, really care about the
Mm,
world that our children and our grandchildren and all children
yeah.
everywhere are
Yeah.
going to inherit. And I think for anyone who's made any kind of a healing journey or looked deeply into what's going on in their own life,
Yeah.
it's really difficult not to see. And I think sometimes we don't see it, but I think it's difficult not to see that what we want the best for our children.
Mm,
On every level, you want your granddaughter to be in a school where she's received, where she's happy, where
yeah.
she's learning, where she's included, where she feels valued, and
Mm,
where her successes are celebrated. And we all want that for the
yeah.
people we love. And yet
Yeah.
somehow we manage to have this huge gap between what we want for ourselves and what we allow happen to countless people in our
Exactly.
country and around the world. And
Yeah.
for me, that's a mental health issue. Mentally
Yeah.
healthy
Yeah.
people don't have that kind of divide in their psyche.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question because I have a couple quotes that go to that subject in your book because it's a great point that you make about the difference between our expectation and hopes for not just ourselves, but those close to us, and then what we sort of tolerate in how someone else is treated that we
Right,
would never accept for anybody close to us.
right.
But I want to ask you a kind of a philosophical question that relates to the environmental issues that are so big that our human brain didn't evolve to deal with them because we're not into long-term planning. You call for us to have a level of empathy, and this is literally a question. This is not rhetorical or loaded. Okay, so I'm asking you. Forget this as a podcast. We're just talking.
Okay.
One question I came away from your book with was, from what you know about the human brain, forget how we behave, just how the brain is formed. Is it possible for us to talk ourselves into levels of empathy that we don't feel for the other out there somewhere, um, in a way that actually engages us emotionally so that we follow up and do more than just say make a donation or whatever? In other words, if you follow your logic out to its conclusion, we would change our foreign policy, we would be a different nation, we would be a different people. And my first question is has anybody in history ever done what you're talking about? Because I'm kind of a history buff, and I couldn't point to any point in human evolution where the in group has ever shown empathy for the out group, with some few exceptions. Somebody hides a Jew in their attic in Holland at great personal risk. Yes, it happens, but it's rare. And on a national level, and I'm going where you go because you talk about foreign policy, you talk about military policy. Um, and there's nothing in your book I disagree with. In other words, all your hopes and wishes and analysis I agree with, but I have one overarching philosophical question. What is the point of calling for a kind of a national change in consciousness about others when the human brain, it seems to me, in my humble, unlettered opinion, um, is not wired to find that level of empathy outside of our tight little group, whether it's your family or a little further out, the people who you work with. You get past that, and I don't think that it's easy to call people to feel things on a larger scale. I'm not sure I'm right. I don't know. I'm really asking a question.
Well, I think it's a really good question because we're not seeing that happen on a mass scale, what you're talking about, that
Yeah,
masses of people are suddenly becoming very empathic to the human condition. So I think
yeah,
it's a question. I think there's two basic things that I would say from the point of view of our psychology, which is what everything I say is.
yeah.
That is what brings people to therapy by and large, 99.9% of all people that I've ever seen as clients over the 34 plus years that I've worked
Yeah.
is pain.
Mm.
Something isn't working so badly that they're willing to get help, look for
Yeah.
some kind of expertise, see things through a new light, and ultimately, if possible, change something
Mm.
internal and in their behavior, in their relational life. And
Yeah.
99.9 or maybe 100% of the pain that people bring to therapy is in failed human relations.
Yes.
It's always some injury to love and safe belonging at its core that
Mm.
causes that pain, often happened in childhood or growing up, and is getting repeated in the present in some way that's intolerable.
Yeah.
So I think for the many, many people in our country and around the world who are actually trying to make us aware of
Mm.
the level of pain that so many people are feeling, that they're feeling themselves. I've
Mm.
gone through myself as a client, as someone who suffered as a child, and really make that common knowledge and bring it to light. And there are so many people doing that today who are
Yeah.
really trying to say, we're in trouble. People are talking about a third world war.
Yeah.
How insane is that?
Yeah.
And when do we feel the level of pain necessary as a collective that
Mm.
would actually have us commit to changing courses,
Yeah.
which, as you say, and as we know, even in our own lives, can be very difficult to do because
Yeah.
we're wired a certain way, we have a certain kind of conditioning, we grew up with certain beliefs about who we're
Hmm.
supposed to be and who's right and who's wrong, and all of that. So it's not an easy thing, but if we can become aware of at what great risk we are now to ourselves. It's not just the people on the other side of the
Of
world.
course.
A
Yes.
third world war would be the end for all of us.
Yeah, and a very kind of destructive era we live in. And of course, then there's one other large question I want to ask you that is not so much addressed directly in the book, but of course, it seems to me, again, speaking as a grandparent and a parent, that the context in which people are now spending their childhoods, which is uncharted territory technologically and so forth,
Yes.
introduces a new level of stress and threat where I think it seems to me, just speaking for myself, one of my worries, one of my things that gives me pain right now is so much of my relationship with my grandchildren seems beyond my control because I'm not writing the algorithms for the phones. I'm not um, I don't have the ability to undo that. Back in the day when I was raising my kids, it was all what books are on the shelf. And I'm not talking about keeping things away from children. I'm very open spirited that way. But it might be the Marquis de Sade, but they were all there for a reason. They were interesting, good books. They were books that would build not necessarily character, but certainly, knowledge. They were things that would leave you somewhat better off. Now, it just seems to me so much of what touches the lives of young people is very detrimental. And I'm not talking from the point of view of a 17-year-old grandfather. I'm talking about just shortened attention spans. The article I read last week in the New York Times saying that the big problem at Columbia University now, I just said Columbia University, is that the incoming student body will not complete a reading list of big books because they don't have the ability to do it. And they complain that they're having to read a whole book. Why can't they just read an excerpt? So it just seems to me that, again, before I dive into the book specifically here, that there's an overarching philosophical question here, and then that'll be the last one of these, of the kind of moving target that we're in. So, you're writing a book that's contemporary and almost before the ink is dry on the printing press or on
Right.
Kindle, it's a new world again because now all of a sudden AI has stolen your book. They're training an algorithm with it, and we're into a thing where we can't. Our points of contact to make change are not in our hands now. We are losing the ability to reach out and do things. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly something that feels true. So when it
Well,
comes to mental health, I can't think of there's so much between you and your patient or you and me here that we don't have anything to do with because of just this onslaught um, of what we face technologically. And I think that's kind of a new wrinkle.
well, I like what you said, and I think, I'm very aware of what you're saying as well, and I think many, many people are. And I think there's a couple of things that are important about it. One of them is that feeling of helplessness
Yeah.
to impact the larger conditions that are impacting so much of us and really impacting all of us, that
Yes.
helplessness that people feel, I think, has exponentially grown. And
Yeah.
I've heard so many, intelligent people say, well, we're just done for, or there's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what we're suffering from, because the feeling of helplessness by itself is
Yeah.
an injury to our psyches. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I talk about, among a million other things, is it's really important to focus on what you can do. Not
Mm-mm.
the savior of the world. No one podcast is going to change
Right.
everything. But
Right.
who knows the ripple effect if we give it our all, if we
Yeah.
each give it our all. And so that's where I think an authentic and valuable feeling of actual personal power does lie. I
Yeah.
can write a book. I can share what I've learned over 34 years of working with clients and having been a client myself. And
Yeah.
maybe I'll reach somebody in a position of greater power than I am. I
Mm.
don't know, but I'll still give it my all. So
Mm.
I think that's one thing. The other point that I really want to make, and I think this is really critical to our world, is just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
Yeah. Good point.
We have to wake up really as a collective. And I say this without blame. I say
Hmm.
this without, any negativity, but really as a hope. Just because we can build nuclear weapons doesn't
Yeah.
mean we should.
Yeah.
Just because we can proliferate all kinds of garbage on social media doesn't mean we should. And I
Yeah.
think we have to look at the impact, and that's what psychology does. We look
Yeah.
at the impact non-judgmentally, but with a desire to heal, the impact of the negative and toxic kinds of human relations and
Hmm.
behaviors that have hurt us.
Yeah.
And the focus is to heal our own wounds. And every person who does any kind of work to heal their own wounding is going to
Mm.
be one less person who proliferates that in the world.
Yeah.
And
And
we,
of course, there's another step there because you've written a book about it, but also would be true of any author, that writes fiction or nonfiction, but anybody who speaks, even in conversation. And that is by sharing our own stories, you let other people know they're not alone
that's right.
in their struggles. And again, I'm going to dive into America in Therapy, a new approach to hope and healing for a nation in crisis by Phyllis Leavitt. Here's the book. I There's my proof of I've read it, and I'm going to go to those some pages I've turned on. But I want to ask you your background. You talked about being in therapy yourself, having some struggles yourself. Just before we get to the quotes in the book I want to discuss, give me a thumbnail of your own journey as a human. Mine is evangelical background. I left it. I'm a more secular person now, father, grandfather, and so forth, but basically raised to be an asshole by divine right because I was raised in a patriarchal environment in which I was the boss in charge, too harsh with my kids, would like to get all that back. Thank God I have a good relationship with them now. Many regrets about how I treated other people. It's not somebody else's fault. My problem. I was raised to be the worst of myself, if I can put it that way. But then I was the worst of myself. So a long journey through that, some therapy involved, lots of rethinking of things, a lot of apologies, a lot of changing of the way I behaved and so on. So my journey is not a nice sparkling, hey, do what I did. It's like, you know, I survived myself long enough to be forgiven by some people who I owed an apology to. I mean, it's a weird way to put it, but that's me. So
Yeah.
what's your passage to writing this book? Who are you?
Totally. I grew up in what appeared to be a normal family on a normal suburban street, but in fact, I was sexually abused from a very young age, and I had buried all those memories. And all
Mm,
I knew growing up was that there was something wrong with me.
yeah.
I didn't know what it was, and I felt completely alone. I felt like I didn't belong anywhere at
Mm,
all. And I
mm,
did my best to hide that because I was ashamed of feeling that way and I was scared of feeling that way.
mm,
And I overcompensated by being the best student I could be. And education and getting good grades were the one thing in my family that I could do right.
mm.
So I became a really good student, and I just was very, very, very deeply unhappy. I think if I had had the body of someone who could become an addict, I probably would have.
Yeah.
I didn't like any of that stuff, so I never
Mm,
went there. So I just sort of had no way to
mm,
mediate the pain that I was living in, except to try to keep burying it until I was in my early 30s and the memories started to emerge. And it
mm,
was a very, very painful time
mm,
of my life. And I had three little children at that point. I was in a very dysfunctional marriage, and I went to therapy. Finally went to therapy, and it changed everything. It wasn't the only thing, but it was a huge part of what really changed my life, because
mm.
as I remembered and as I began to process the impact of what happened to me, um, I was no longer a mystery to myself.
Yeah.
It wasn't like this. And I understood, as you were saying, I read tons of books by other people who had survived and thrived
Mhm.
after doing their own healing journey. And it was very inspiring to me. I didn't feel alone. And
Yeah.
I really made through that process. And it, like I said, it was a very deep process and it took quite a while.
Mm,
I really made contact with my most essential self that had been buried
mm,
underneath all of that pain. And that
mm.
was what really changed my life.
Sounds
And
like you had some somebody good to work with or some good people
I did.
pointed you in the right direction.
I did. I worked with a number of people, and then I finally found somebody who could really like go all the way with me.
Yeah.
'Cause it was scary, but it was not traumatizing. It was a relief. It
Mm,
was life-giving, and I can't say that strongly enough because so many people are afraid to go back into the past because they're
yeah.
afraid they're going to be re-traumatized. And I've never worked with anyone who was re-traumatized by
Mm,
uncovering the pain of their past because
yeah.
it's a key to healing. So
Yeah.
that's my background. I
That's
became
you.
a therapist.
Well, hey, I keep talking about the book. Let's do it. America in Therapy. And we have the author sitting right here. So let me just start. And I'm going to do some of these quickly, and then because I've got a lot here. Um, there is an enormous gap between what we want and value for ourselves and our loved ones: peace, love, adequate resources, safety, cooperation, and the vicious wars on our own citizens we condone, to say nothing of the wars we fund and wage around the world. The assault we witness on minorities would be devastating if it were turned on us. So that kind of opens your argument for just looking at the world in what I call very personal terms. This isn't somebody else. This is my family out here. Put myself in the position of the father of somebody who just got killed by, a US made bomb somewhere. And I have a different reaction than if it's just politics. So I love that thread that runs through your book. So talk about that thread a little bit and then we'll keep moving through it so we can get some stuff done here.
Yeah, because I think, in the world of psychology, and which I don't think is commonly known, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book for the layman. It's not an academic book. I think, the average person who has no exposure to what happens and what we can understand in the world of psychology may really not understand that what we want for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
that what those things that you mentioned, those are the signs of a mentally healthy person, a person
Right.
who's loving, a person who's inclusive, a person who can tolerate their own distress without
Yeah.
acting out on other people or hurting themselves,
Mm.
someone who values life, someone who is committed to nonviolence.
Yeah.
These are actually the signs of mental health. And again,
Mm. Mm.
none of us does it perfectly, but if we're relatively mentally healthy, we try to return to those values the
Yeah.
best we can.
Well, one of the interesting things about your book, and I mentioned it again, but I'm going to mention it, is this thread of kind of international foreign and military policy combined with personal mental health, and then bad policy as an example of collective mental health failing. I just find that so interesting. I read quite a bit. I don't think I've seen anybody put those together before. It's like, um, foreign policy through the eyes of someone who does counseling with people, trying to draw a line between individual personal behavior, because usually when you talk to therapists, it's all about the individual, this person's story, how to help them. You're saying, no, the result should be we change our country enough so we act differently collectively. And I find that wonderful and interesting and different. I mean, I've never seen anybody else do this.
Yeah, I don't know
Have
that
you?
anybody has, but to me it was like, duh,
Yeah,
once,
it's a no-brainer.
right. Once you're familiar with family dynamics and what makes a healthy family and what are the
Yeah.
characteristics of an abusive family, it's really impossible for me not to see that this is all over the place.
Yeah,
And
and also, foreign policy as a function of mental health or mental illness.
absolutely. And that's
Very interesting.
why I think that a consideration of mental health and making it part of our national conversation and agenda is
Yeah.
really, I think, the biggest missing piece. And it's why we're in so much trouble today.
Yeah, and
So,
I just want to point out to people listening to this, that's really an original thought, by the way, because I read quite a bit. I read things I got a huge stack of books here that I'm reading, people I'm interviewing. No, I haven't seen anybody make that connection. Either it's one or the other. It's either somebody writing about foreign policy or mental health is all seen from a personal point of view. Your relationship maybe with your husband or wife or lover or child, but it doesn't go much further than that. So I love that about your book. Let me grab another quote here. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that abuse and neglect cause massive suffering. Abusers and families ostracize, blame, withhold necessities, exploit, physically and sexually assault, and take victims hostage. Abusive governing bodies, this is where I love your jump here, do the same things. So, it's the same thing we just did, but I want you to keep going there. So, what's that about?
yeah. And I think, well, one of the things that's so important about the field of psychology today is that we look through the family system lens when we're looking at the individual. So when someone comes to therapy, even if they come by themselves, we talk about their upbringing. We talk about the role models of behavior in their family for men and women, for conflict resolution. What were the values? What was considered success? What was punished? What was, applauded? And we're all groupings of people operate on family systems dynamics, and that's,
Yeah.
I don't think, is common knowledge. So a country operates on family systems dynamics. In an
Mm,
individual family, when you have, and I've worked with, so many families and so many children over the years, when you have parents that are fighting, that are hostile, that are
yeah.
putting each other down, that are screaming, that are addicted, or whatever they're suffering from, and I say
Yeah.
suffering from, their children are highly impacted. Almost
Yes.
every child I ever saw for therapy in the beginning of my practice, there was nothing wrong with them. They were the symptom bearer for the stress in their home, generally
Yeah.
between their parents.
Yeah.
And
Well,
if
and then you take it a step further and say our national policy and who we are as a nation is the symptom bearer for our mental illness.
That's right. And the reverse is also true.
Yeah.
The national mental ill health that we're witnessing,
Mm,
the extreme violent rhetoric, death threats going out to people, the
sure.
inability and the unwillingness to sit down and actually work issues out for the good
Yeah.
of the family of America is exactly what makes people symptomatic. And it's making adults symptomatic in our country, many of us, just the way children are symptomatic in their homes when there's ongoing fighting and
Yeah.
violence.
Yeah. And
So
I just have to add from my point of view, and you do not say this in your book, so I'm going to be clear. This is just my point of view. Um, we think in terms of the left and the right, and conservative and Republicans and Democrats and religious and secular. But I do think that in this instance, I'm not talking about kind of moral relativism here, but it seems to me that in this particular thing, the left and the right have an equal burden to bear because when you have people on the left who call themselves of the left anyway, which seems to me you know a kind of an oxymoronic way to define somebody from the left. But when you talk about canceling people because they use the wrong pronoun, or if you're talking from the right wing about killing people because they don't support the Second Amendment, you're into a territory where conversation's impossible. So now you can't have any. To me, that's the equivalent of the abusive parent because essentially you're just shutting down the conversation with everybody
right.
and
That's
you're
right.
just saying we'll cancel you. And I find that is so problematic of the period of history we're in. Do you want to address that? I mean, I'm not saying you say that in your book, but that's just my impression.
Well, what I am saying in my book is that we're not committed as a nation to sitting down together and working it out, even with
Right,
the extreme differences that we have.
right.
People will always have differences. That's
Yeah, of
just the
course.
nature of being a human being.
Yeah.
But mentally healthy people are committed to working them out or leaving
Mm.
each other alone in peace.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And that's what we're not seeing. And that's one of the deficiencies of mental health that we're seeing on a national level. And it's really because we're still living in a paradigm that is actually outdated. And that's the
Mm,
lose paradigm. Somebody
yes.
has to lose.
Yeah.
What we're not factoring, and what I really try to outline in detail in my book, is the people who lose don't go away,
Yeah. Yeah.
suffer. And to the extent that they lose badly, or that they're really discriminated against or withheld from or
Yeah.
reviled in the news, they suffer greatly. Their children suffer greatly, and
Hmm.
they become symptomatic. They
Yeah.
don't go away.
Yeah. They
So,
don't go away. It's not if you defeat them in an election, they're gone. No, they come back and they're furious, and now they do the
right.
next step. Yeah, exactly.
So
You
it's,
say I don't know how to say this strongly enough or shout it loud enough. What we do to one another, we do to all of us. And then just jumping across the page here, we want all things high tech, it seems, the latest phones, computers, and fastest cars with all the bells and whistles. We pour billions into the most advanced weapons. Yet somehow we've lost sight of the need to upgrade the ways we relate to each other. And those two show up across each other from the page, but those are related thoughts. So again, the correlation of personal behavior and what you might call the public result, and then the international result, even in terms of American pathology now pouring out into the globe because we're a powerful country. I mean, you make that argument.
yeah. Well, I think the most symptomatic people among us, especially the ones who become the most violent, the most exploitive, the most kind of nihilistic, they are actually, and I talk about this, and I don't think this is common knowledge to people who aren't familiar with the world
Yeah.
of psychology. They're symptoms bearers for the ills of their family and the
Mm,
ills of the larger family systems they're a part of.
yeah.
People are not born murderers. They're
Yeah.
not born rapists.
Yeah.
Something happens to them
Yeah.
that has them blow up later in their personal relations. And
Yeah.
the point that I make in my book is, if your car engine blows, we're on it. If your computer dies, we're on it. If your
Yeah.
phone is working, we're on it. But when a person blows, we blame them instead of really looking for what caused them to blow.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and that's really where I think the whole world of psychology has something so valuable to offer.
Offer. Yeah.
Would it be easy to implement? No, because
Mm,
when people come to therapy and they're used to believing what they're believing, that person's wrong and bad, and I have a right to shout, or I have a right to hit, or I have a right to slam the door in their face.
yeah.
That has to be undone. But
Mm,
how it gets undone is really working with what set them up to believe
yeah.
that it is okay. And you talk about that in your own life.
Yeah. And somebody just sent this question in, Ernie, our producer, passed it on to me. There's a viewer question. Technology has stripped our kids of all their spare time. Reading a book seems to have taken a backseat to chatting on the phones, computers. How do we get our time back?
Mhm. Well, I think it starts with each one of us.
Yeah.
I think that's the only place to start. It starts with the parent who says, this really isn't good for you. The technology is highly addictive. It can be very valuable. We can get great information. We can make incredible connections like you and I are doing right now. And it can also be highly destructive. So
Mm,
it takes people calling this out. It takes people researching the effects. It takes one parent at a time saying it's time to get off your phone. You need to
yeah.
read a book or go outside and play, or let's take a hike. And it goes back to what I said before. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And I
Mm,
think of all of this as the food we're eating. You
mm,
know, you and I probably don't want to eat toxic food. We don't want to
right.
eat with a lot of chemicals in it. We want to eat, as organic or healthy as we possibly can. And what we're taking in from other people, from social media, from the world around us, from the
Mm,
news, from what's going on in our school or a place of work, that's all part of what we're digesting.
yeah.
And responsible people who, have some kind of, awareness in themselves want that food to be healthy. We want
Mm,
our human relations environment to be healthy food, just like the food we eat. And that means we might have to change our diet, you
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
right?
I'm just reintroduce you here. I'm talking about this book here with the author, Phyllis Leavitt, and it's America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. Interesting thread through the book is making connection between foreign policy and what we do politically and personal stories. Now, I'm giving a wrong impression of what this book is like when you read it, because I'm jumping from topic to topic, but actually there are a lot of stories in here which illustrate the point. But you must read the book to get the stories. And I just want to go to another sentence here that will be good in terms of setting up a little bit of a discussion here. You say, societally, we are slow to make the connection between the degree to which many people are suffering and how symptomatic so many of us have become. As a result, not only do abusers blame their victims, but as a society, we often join in justifying abuse and blaming victims for their symptoms as well. And, and this is something I think I do myself in some of my political critiques, because just to give you a current example, I know that Elon Musk had a terrible childhood, and I really don't like the way he's involving himself in politics with his billions, kind of backing up someone that I'm not going to vote for. On the other hand, when you look at his biography, assuming that some bare facts are there, he was abused, he was put in a stool that he hated, he was bullied, and so forth. He had a hard time, so it's easy, and maybe he's somewhere on the spectrum, at least he says he is. So on a human level, he's the kind of person that, should be talking to you, just like I have my therapist that I've talked to. I'm not saying he should, and I don't, I'm in the same boat. But it's a little scary, and I'm wondering what your advice on this is, and I'm being serious about this. When you're a public commentator, like I am with my podcast and my commentary, I find myself being harsh with people who I think are doing a terrific amount of damage to us. But when I think about them as an individual human, if I had known him since childhood, he's about the age of my oldest son, um, I would probably understand where he's coming from more and be more sympathetic. On the other hand, I feel that I need to make a public comment on the damage that I think he's doing to our society by imposing his politics via his billions. How do you deal with that? And I mean you personally, Phyllis, what do
Yeah,
you do?
yeah.
How do you modify public critique to take into the account the level of compassion you're talking about all of us having? And I mean that as a sincere question.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually a very, very important question, because
Yeah,
we have not learned how to do that. None of
yeah,
us have learned how to do
yeah.
that. It's a new conversation. So I think what we're looking at is, yes, we have to hold ourselves and others accountable for
Mm,
the damage they're doing. And in the best therapy, we do that too.
mm,
I talk about a client in my book who was beaten her whole childhood, and she had no idea she was abused because she believed what she was told was that she deserved it. So yes, just even pointing out that these behaviors are abusive, that they harm people, that they create ripple effects of lasting damage
yeah.
in homes and in society is important. But we have to combine those two things that you just brought up.
Mm,
And they come from somewhere. You
yeah.
know, people didn't become, people who killed their own children or beat their
Right.
spouse, or went and shot up a school. They didn't come that way by accident.
Yeah.
Something happened to them. And so for me, one of the things that's most heartbreaking for me when I read anything that's going on in the world is that we're not having that conversation. We're
Yeah.
just talking about, this terrible thing happened and that person did this horrible thing and they
Hmm.
said this, and we don't talk about where did it come from, and we
Yeah.
don't talk about the compassion that we need to have while we hold ourselves and other
Mm,
people responsible. And
yeah.
and that's what therapy does. That's
Hmm.
exactly what therapy does. That's what good
Mm.
psychology does. Because it looks for the pain underneath the perpetration.
The thing that's happening. Let me go to something here I found interesting. We are a strange species, you write. We celebrate our martyrs, mourn their deaths, and create holidays in their names, but we have not yet sat down together and asked ourselves why people must be killed before we can venerate them. What would our lives be like if we had celebrated them and heeded their calls for love, peace, and justice while they were living? I think that's a lovely paragraph, but it's also brings up a good point. So that's kind of from the first third of your book, and it follows up with something I want to read here. and then let you comment on both of these points. I made a little note here in the book here. I write
Right.
big point. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Nothing presented here is intended to be an excuse for terrible behavior. But if we stay focused on symptoms, in this case, the symptom of identification with the aggressor, we can easily forget the cause. The problem is abuse and what results when it is not stopped or treated. Let's look at it this way. If two people contract the same flu, one might have a fever and chills, and another might get a sore throat and a headache. They both got the same germs, but their bodies react differently. We need to know all possible symptoms of the flu to find the best treatment and prevention for the flu itself, no matter how it manifests. The problem we are facing in the epidemic of abuse and mass mental illness associated with it here in America is that we do not yet have a common understanding of the full range of abuse symptoms, which we need if we are going to stop its spread and invest in the best ways to treat it. Prevention ultimately is the cure, and it is based in an understanding and implication of high-tech human relations on every level of our structure. There's so much in that paragraph to unpack, so you're here, unpack it for me.
Yeah. So a big thing that I want to say is that I think is not general knowledge, but I've seen this over, so many years of working with people, is that when abuse and neglect are untreated, when people do not find safety and they do not find a way to heal from the impact of what happened to them, which was harmful behavior, hurtful behavior, dangerous behavior from other people, there are many symptoms, and we've talked, there's many symptoms like depression and anxiety and obsessiveness and rage and acting out and acting in, all the way on a continuum to homicide and suicide. There are two big patterns that I talk about in my book that I don't think are common knowledge. And they are this, that people tend, when they don't get any help or any rescue, they tend to follow one of two paths. And one I call, and I didn't make this phrase up, this is a psychological term, it's called learned helplessness. They were so overpowered that they really have given up believing that they have any power to help themselves, to get to safety, to be heard, to be believed, and to get help. And so their response when there's a threat from the outside, whether it's one person or their culture, is to freeze and lie low and try to just endure it. And you see this in so many people who, and we say, what's wrong with them? The parent who stood by while their child was beaten to death and didn't raise a finger. Well, they didn't come by that helplessness in that moment. Something set them up to actually be unable to respond. So we have more and more people in an abusive culture and an abusive society who become some degree of learned hopeless and helpless. And they're easily persuaded, they're easily dominated, and they're easily controlled.
Yeah.
Other main outcome are those people who will do anything not to feel their vulnerability, who are they identify with the aggressor, and they become like the people who hurt them in some way. They become dominating, they become controlling, and they often become abusers themselves. So if you have these two patterns proliferating in a society that does not stop abuse in its homes or in its culture, in its politics, then you have more and more people who are easily dominated and who are submissive, and you have more and more people who have identified with the aggressor. And I say this in my book, so I'll say it on your show. When you have people who have identified with the aggressor, who cannot tolerate vulnerability and who often punish it in other people, who run for office, then you have extreme mental health danger in politics. And I think we're seeing some of that.
Yeah, and of course, then it pours into the rest of our lives, and then we become ourselves even more, find ourselves in an even more precarious position
Right.
in terms of mental health, because, nothing stresses you out more than what we face right now in this current election cycle, where you have Donald Trump, who had an abusive past.
Right.
His relationship with his father from all the biographies was awful. His father was an awful abuser. And, all of a sudden, there's a whole cult following him that is one of those two things, actually. They're either completely submissive and they come out of church backgrounds and so forth that have taught them to submit to authority figures, or they themselves are a kind of, open carry, angry, Confederate flag waving abusers. So it's an interesting moment we're in because, your book here, America in Therapy, I mean, if ever you didn't intend to do this, but it's kind of like, ripped from the headlines because we're in a position right now of all feeling pretty precarious. You talk about facing and releasing pain and all the negative beliefs and projections we have absorbed over time. These are the keys to uncovering greatness, the greatness we contain. One of the most valuable gifts of the best therapy is that therapists hold that there is an essential self in all of us waiting to emerge and flower, as Monica, and that's the story you tell, discovered. And that to get to that gold, we undo the destructive family dynamics that buried it. This is the very opposite of focusing on our injuries and failings with the intent to judge, condemn, and punish. We focus on what hasn't worked and isn't working to get to the essence that lies beneath and find what does work. The good news is we do not have to be therapists to do this for one another. We don't need a degree. We need to unearth the gold in ourselves and hold that light for one another. This is the safe passage that good therapy gives us to recover and reclaim both our inner and our outer homeland. So taking that as a point of departure, and I don't want to put words in your mouth again, but you went there sort of to put it in the political moment. Do you think that if we got to some of the people we're thinking about in terms of American politics now, if you had as a therapist, knowing what you know now at your age now, not when you were then, but if you had been part of the life of some of these tech bros who were so cruel in the way they seem to think about other people and so manipulative and so uncaring in terms of the effect of their technology on others, let alone the politics of someone like Elon Musk, or if you had been the favorite aunt of a Donald Trump when he was a 3-year-old and hung there with him through his youth, talk a little bit about the impact that, in an imagined past would have, not just on those people, individuals, I don't want to pick on them, but in general. I'll put this in the context of my own life. I've met people later in my life and sometimes said to myself, one therapist in particular, who deals with kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome in people who come from intensely conservative religious backgrounds, Marlene Winnell. And, you're just saying, wow, I wish I'd had this conversation 40 years ago. I guess it's the purview of science fiction writers, but I like to imagine past of how things could have been different if someone else could have influenced some of the people that are the cruelest that we run into in public life these days.
I'm not quite sure what your question is out of all that.
Well, I guess I'm asking you if you had been able to sit down and have some therapy with a few of the people who we know in our country right now, like Donald Trump or Elon Musk or some of these tech bros that have invented these things. If you had sat down with them and say, just because you can do something, maybe that doesn't mean you should, what you've been saying. I would like to think that there are people who you've changed, who might be a future leader or a husband or a wife or a parent, who are going to be different than they would have been if they hadn't sat down with you.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I said earlier, like what brings the person to therapy. If I could have sat down with one of these people, I would go for where they're hurting, because where they're hurting and what isn't working is the access to what happened to them that malformed their view of themselves and their human relations with other people. And it's out of that, in other words, it's really hard to tell somebody who's deeply entrenched in what I would consider a destructive life point of view or behavior to just say you shouldn't do that, because they have all the reasons in the world. And we know this from looking at family dynamics, that people who hurt other people have all the justifications in the world for why they do what they do, and they believe them. So trying to talk somebody out of that behavior is probably less effective, unless you can say, that person is a bomb and they're going to come and kill you.
Sure.
is probably less effective than going for where it hurts in them. And
Mm,
because that's really the access. That was the access for me. That was the access for every client I've ever
mm,
worked with. We go into the history, but you have to have somebody who's willing to go there because they're hurting enough. And so if we don't have leaders right now who are hurting enough themselves to go there, then we have to have a populace that demands it.
yeah,
And
it's a
that's
good
an
point.
informed populace. That's a populace that has done some work themselves, that knows what's at stake. And then we elect different people. Do we have time to do that in America? I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, I'm talking about this book here, American Therapy, a New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. And one of the threads I'm following is the kind of public implications of this private discussion, if you want to put it that way, of what we all need in terms of our own character development. Um, you write, this we know from the best psychology is that healthy adult dependency can best be understood as embracing our interdependence. And that's so different than the sort of for survival of the fittest idea that drives so much of our world, you know,
Absolutely.
replaced by some good thinkers who have said, no, no, the real thing is that leads to survival is the survival of the friendliest, because it's cooperation that builds cultures, not lording it over people. But just kind of unpack that sentence. What we know from the best psychology is that healthy adult dependency can best be understood as embracing our interdependence. And you have here, you know, the word, the inter part of interdependence, you've got in italics there. You
Uh-huh. Right.
italicize, so interdependence. So you're kind of making your point. Just talk about that a little bit.
We'll have a whole chapter about it, but I'll try
Yes,
to
I
put it
know. I
in a
pulled it from
nutshell.
that.
Yeah, I'll try to put it in a nutshell. And that I think, one of the huge illusions we live under in America is that we really esteem independence. And
Mm,
it's a fallacy. We're not independent. Nobody is. I depend on people all over the world for the things that make my life possible. I depend on my neighbor to be safe for me. I depend on somebody in a foreign country not to pollute the oceans. I depend on our country and people all over the world not to drop nuclear weapons on me. And in our own lives, even if we're not talking on a global level, how many people really want to just be alone?
mm,
We want spouses who love us. We want to
yeah.
have relationships with our children, and we need that. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a sign of weakness to
Yes.
need close relationship with other people. But somehow we're still living in this myth that
Mm,
it's actually the goal is I don't need you. I don't actually need anybody,
yeah.
which it's just patently untrue. And so
Mm,
it's actually a sign of good mental health to embrace that we need each other. And I say it in my chapter this way, as adults, not as 2-year-olds in
sure.
ourselves hanging on somebody's leg or, that kind of thing. But in our adult self, it's actually a sign of strength and courage. And it actually opens up a whole wonderful world of
Mm,
relationship to be able to say, I need you. I
yeah,
want you in my
absolutely.
life.
Yeah.
Um, and as a world, it's actually, I think our whole survival depends on understanding that we actually really need each other. And we
Yeah, and
need
I
each other.
think people are writing about the sort of short shrift we've given young males in this view, sort of from a certain angle. All masculinity is treated as toxic, which is stupid, of course. But then on the other hand, the idea that you see in terms of our ideas of success, whether for males or females, um, it seems to me that what you're talking about is a sign of strength. It seems to me that I find my male strength in my relationship of the glad smile I see on my granddaughter's face when I pick her up from school. I've got a snack in the car I've cooked for her. I care. This isn't some feminine, caring is not feminine. Caring
That's
is
right.
human.
That's right.
And I find as a male, quote unquote, um, embracing that in my life has been the greatest source of my joy. It's where I find my best moments. It's not in, power over other people.
That's
you,
right.
you know, I mean, the truest thing I ever read that makes me happy that, yeah, you did something there is, what I see in the eyes of people I love, and they see that I love them. That's, I don't think that's a male or female thing. I think that's a human. And I think it's such a deficit in our culture, the idea of masculinity with these online people and people, I don't know, the sort of kickboxing world or Joe Rogan, this kind of thing. To me, these are weak. This is a weak kind of masculinity. I feel strong as a male when I am greeted by children who would rather see me than anybody else on earth this day. And I got a snack in one hand and I've come to get them and I'm going to talk to them. And what music would you like to play? To me, that's what being a man is all about. I'm caring for somebody. And
Right.
that speaking just selfishly, those are the moments that I get up in the morning for. Whereas, anyway, so let me just ask you to go into this a little bit here. The focus of family therapy is on the common good, which creates peace for everyone. The case for peace, and I like that you capitalize the case for peace like its title, I am talking about for America is the peace that is born of us taking a stand together for our common good. That means all of us, everyone, the family of America. If you are not safe, then I am not safe either. And wow, that paragraph should be what we see on yard signs right now as we head into this moment of election and division and so forth. I mean, I just cannot emphasize what a good thing that is. If you are not safe, then I am not safe either. I just think that's a tremendous sentence.
And let me just add one to it that I say a lot because I really feel so strongly about it, and that is this. We have been programmed to believe that we need bigger weapons, meaner laws,
Mhm.
bigger walls, whatever, to be safe. And it's
Right,
absolutely not true. The
right.
only thing that makes us safe is safe people. That's
Mm,
the only thing that will ever make us safe. And
yeah,
that's where our investment and our time and our tax dollars and our energy should be going. How
mm,
do we help people heal so that they are safe for themselves and all the people around them? And we're not safe to the extent that we perpetuate and vote for and legislate policies that continue to abuse people and huge segments of our population. And then we wonder, why are there all these mass shooters? Well, it's
sure.
actually rocket science. And if we look into the world of psychology and
Yeah,
human relations and family dynamics, the answers are clear.
yeah.
People who go into a school and kill children they don't even know are
Mm,
massively hurting, enraged human beings
yeah.
who have, for some reason, in their own experience, lost touch with their own humanity and the humanity of other people. And that's where our work has to lie. It's not
Yeah,
in putting guns in the hands of teachers. That's not the
yeah,
answer.
that's not the answer. It's so interesting from that point of view. I'm always interested. I like traveling a little bit. Um, I happen to know Florence, Italy pretty well, and a couple other Italian towns. And what's so interesting is you can tell exactly what period of history each palazzo is from based on whether they have large open windows on the ground floor.
Oh, interesting.
If the ground floor, if the first three floors are solid stone and the windows only start on the fourth floor, you know exactly when they were built.
Wow.
When the windows come down and there's just bars, things were a little better. When there are open windows on the ground floor of a palace and all there is glass and a little bit of wood between you and the street, you know that they felt safe. And those were moments of prosperity for the whole population because the population itself felt safe. And I know that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but actually that's a historical truism.
I think that's a fabulous metaphor. I love
Yeah.
that.
And it
Yeah.
happens to be true. When you try, I grew up in Europe and I've traveled a lot, and you can tell what period of history you're in by what do the windows look like on the ground floor. And if there are none and just a big barred gate, you know how they all felt about the world around them.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So in any case, let me recommend your book and just say that I think it would make a good addition to our book club. It has to be read. So we can maybe have it out in December as an it has to be read book. If you'll allow us to include it in our book club. And the
I
other
love
thing is when I get off the line here with you, talk about being an old white guy. This isn't a phone call and it's not a landline, but when I get off the line with you, um, please stay on and talk to my producer, Ernie, for two reasons. First, we want to link to everything you want linked to.
Okay.
So how people get in touch with you, who would want to talk to you, how to get your book. We're going to do all that wherever this goes. And you can tell Ernie all that. And also, if having talked to me about this book, you think of someone we should talk to in your field or outside of it, doesn't have to be an expert, doesn't have to be an author, but you're thinking, you know, Frank would have a good conversation with, fill in the blank. Give her any ideas you have of somebody we might not know about that we should include in our conversations.
Okay, sounds good.
Because we've gotten some good guests that way, because we always assume that people we talk to know more than we do. So that's, if you
Well,
would help
thank
us out, that
you
would be
so
great.
much. Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
so please subscribe to YouTube in Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, my commentaries at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And I want to thank Phyllis Leavitt again for America in Therapy. Wonderful stories in here that you tell about the people you've worked with and the experiences they've had, which we didn't go to, because then you're just retelling your stories.
Right.
And it's better to talk about the issues. And we're so in the moment of issues here, of hurt people, including a few running for office that seem to be very big in our country right now, that seem to mirror, some real mental health issues and the way they're projecting them onto the rest of us, and the kind of anger and harshness is, I mean, you've written a book for the moment we're in. So thank you, Phyllis.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for this wonderful discussion. I really
Yeah, and a real pleasure, and lovely to talk to you. And again, for anybody who may have quote unquote tuned in a little late, this Band-Aid is because I had a melanoma taken off by a wonderful plastic surgeon at Mass Eye and Ear, and everything's fine. All the margins are good. I'm in good shape, but I've still got a little bit of an open wound there that hopefully will heal up. And then people watch this in future can say, oh, how's his head looking now? And I'll do a little update for you. Much love to you, Phyllis. Take care of yourself.
much love to you, and ditto. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. This is great.